The Myrtles Plantation in St. Francisville, Louisiana, has long held the reputation of being one of the most haunted houses in America. Built in 1796, the plantation has seen centuries of turmoil, from Civil War conflicts to the ravages of slavery, which has left a deep and dark imprint on the property. One of the most chilling legends is about Chloe, a slave who worked in the house. As the story goes, Chloe became entangled with the owner, Judge Clark Woodruff, either as a servant he forced into a relationship or a woman seeking favor to survive. However, Chloe's life took a dark turn when she was caught eavesdropping on the family and subsequently punished. In revenge or in an attempt to regain her position, she baked a poisonous cake for the Woodruff family. Judge Woodruff's wife, Sarah, and two of their daughters consumed the cake and tragically succumbed to the poison. When the truth about the poisoned cake emerged, Chloe was seized by the other slaves and hanged from a tree on the property as punishment. Legend has it that her spirit remains trapped within the walls of Myrtles Plantation, lingering in a green turban that witnesses have claimed to see. Some visitors report hearing faint whispers, seeing a woman's spectral figure in green, or even feeling a cold hand on their shoulder when walking alone. But Chloe isn't the only ghost said to roam the halls. The haunted mirror is another famous tale at Myrtles. The mirror, left behind in the home, is said to contain the spirits of Sarah Woodruff and her children. According to tradition, mirrors are covered when someone dies to prevent their spirit from being trapped. But for reasons unknown, this mirror was left uncovered. Now, visitors to the plantation report seeing handprints smudged on the glass that no amount of cleaning can remove. Some have even seen shadowy figures within it, almost as if the souls within are pressing their way out. Visitors have also described strange phenomena, from mysterious footsteps in empty rooms to the sound of children's laughter echoing from nowhere. Paranormal investigators who have visited Myrtles have documented cold spots, unexplainable figures on thermal cameras, and even voices caught on EVP recordings. Despite all the scientific attempts to explain these events, many leave convinced that something sinister lingers at Myrtles Plantation. One particularly dark night, a group of amateur ghost hunters arrived at Myrtles Plantation, eager to experience its infamous hauntings firsthand. They came armed with flashlights, EMF detectors, and a sense of daring that would soon be tested. Their guide led them through the dimly lit rooms, sharing stories of ghostly encounters from previous visitors. As they reached the parlor, where the haunted mirror hung, the guide cautioned them not to stand too close. One of the ghost hunters, a skeptic named Ben, couldn't resist and approached the mirror, examining its ornate frame. He looked closely at the glass, expecting nothing but his own reflection staring back. But then, something strange happened. His reflection seemed to lag, almost as if it were delayed. He blinked, and a faint smudge began to form on the mirror, like fingerprints pressing against the glass from the other side. His reflection began to distort, twisting in ways his face should not be able to, eyes becoming hollow and dark. "Do you see that?" Ben asked, his voice shaky. The others watched in horror as, just for a moment, a shadowy figure appeared in the mirror beside Ben, a woman in a green turban. She didn't move. Her eyes seemed to pierce straight through him, cold and accusing. The air in the room dropped several degrees, and a faint whisper echoed, like a hiss. It was hard to make out, but it sounded like, "Why did you come?" Ben staggered backward, breaking the spell. The woman vanished, but the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, surrounding them from all directions. One of the ghost hunters began to panic, convinced something was crawling up his arm, though nothing was there. The group quickly moved to another room, hoping to leave the strange encounter behind. They entered one of the children's bedrooms, now preserved in its original form, with antique toys and tiny beds covered in dusty blankets. Just as they thought the worst was over, they heard it. The sound of children giggling softly, but eerily echoing as if carried on an unseen breeze. Suddenly, a small rocking horse began to creak back and forth on its own, moving slowly but surely. One of the ghost hunters, a woman named Lisa, felt a small hand tugging on her sleeve, gentle at first, but then pulling more insistently. She looked down, her face drained of color as she saw no child there, only a faint outline, like a smoky wisp of a figure, with large, hollow eyes staring up at her. They hurried down the staircase, heading back toward the front door, but halfway down, they heard footsteps above them, heavy, deliberate steps, as though someone were following them down, step by step. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The footsteps echoed closer, growing louder with each creak of the stairs. The ghost hunters froze, gripping the railing as they listened to the slow, measured approach. The guide's face was pale, and for the first time, they noticed a glint of fear in his eyes. "Keep moving. Don't look back," he whispered, urging them to continue down the stairs. But Ben, still skeptical despite everything, couldn't resist. He turned his head ever so slightly and caught a glimpse of something, a dark figure in the shadows, just a few steps behind them. The figure seemed to float, draped in tattered clothing, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Ben's heart pounded, and he stumbled, nearly losing his balance as he reached the bottom step. The group burst into the hallway, but their relief was short-lived. The hallway stretched out before them, impossibly long, as if they were trapped in some distorted maze. The once familiar walls seemed to bend and twist, the wallpaper shifting with strange patterns that writhed and pulsated. The guide glanced around, confusion flickering across his face. This isn't right. The exit should be right here," he stammered, pointing to a door that had somehow disappeared. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped, the hallway stretching out like an endless tunnel, shadows flickering at the edges of their vision. A chill filled the air, colder than before, and with it came a low, mournful humming, a woman's voice, distant yet hauntingly close. The group recognized the melody from the old lullaby Sarah Woodruff had once sung to her children. Lisa clutched her EMF detector, watching it spike wildly as they moved deeper into the hallway. "This isn't possible," she whispered, her voice trembling. We're going in circles." Desperate, they opened doors at random, hoping for any escape. Behind one door, they found a room frozen in time, an old parlor filled with dusty furniture and dimly flickering candles, untouched for what looked like centuries. But as they turned to leave, they noticed something horrific. The portraits on the walls, which had been blank seconds before, now showed familiar faces, their own, captured in expressions of terror. Ben stumbled back, slamming the door shut. "This place is playing tricks on us," he muttered, trying to calm himself. But just as he spoke, the humming grew louder, filling every corner of the house until it felt like it was seeping into their very bones. Suddenly, Chloe's voice cut through the silence, clear and venomous. "Why have you come?" she whispered, as though speaking directly into their ears. Her words echoed, twisting into a chant that sent shivers down their spines. Then, the candlelight flickered out entirely, plunging them into darkness. In the pitch black, they could hear breathing, soft, raspy breaths coming from every direction, closing in on them. One by one, each person felt an icy grip brush against their arms, pulling them deeper into the shadows. Just as the terror peaked, they noticed a faint glow at the end of the hallway. Desperate for any light, they stumbled toward it, hoping it might lead them out. But as they drew closer, they saw it wasn't an exit at all. The glow was coming from the mirror, the haunted mirror in the parlor. Their reflections were waiting for them, but something was horribly wrong. Their mirrored images were twisted, with pale, hollow eyes and expressions frozen in silent screams. Worse still, the reflections began moving of their own accord, reaching toward the glass, pressing their ghostly hands against it, as though trying to claw their way through. The real Ben watched in horror as his reflection grinned back at him, a sinister, mocking smile spreading across its face. The glass began to ripple, and he felt a tug as though something on the other side was pulling him in. Ben fought against the invisible pull, but the force grew stronger, drawing him closer to the mirror's surface. His hand brushed against the glass, which felt cold and sticky, like something alive. He could feel the grip tightening, his own reflection's hollow eyes boring into him with a hunger that felt endless. The others grabbed him, trying to pull him back. Lisa screamed, "We have to get him out of here." But as she gripped his arm, her own reflection reached toward her. Eyes vacant and cruel, a mirror image of terror. She felt her fingers sink slightly into the glass, as if it were softening, drawing her in as well. She jerked her hand back, feeling a cold residue that sent icy tendrils up her arm. The mirror's surface rippled again, almost like water, and an eerie voice began to echo from within. It was soft, almost a whisper, yet filled with malice. "Stay with us. Forever." The words seemed to wrap around them, each syllable dripping with menace. The guide, now pale and visibly trembling, shouted, "We need to break the connection. Step back. Don't let it pull you in." But the mirror was relentless. A faint mist began to seep from the glass, swirling around their ankles and winding its way up, as though the house itself were alive, intent on trapping them. Just then, a low rumbling sound vibrated through the room, followed by the distant laughter of children's voices that sounded like they were coming from everywhere at once, growing louder and closer with each second. Lisa's flashlight flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls, stretching and twisting into distorted faces watching them from every corner. The doorway they had come through moments ago was gone, replaced by solid wall. Frantically, they began pounding on it, desperate for a way out. The shadows in the room thickened, pressing closer, until they felt as if they were suffocating under their weight. And within the shadows, faint outlines of figures began to form, silent, hollow-eyed children holding hands, their heads cocked at unnatural angles, their eyes fixed on the intruders. A low, rasping voice filled the room, blending with the children's laughter. "You didn't listen. You've been warned." The voice was heavy with sorrow and anger, filled with an ancient bitterness. The guide turned, horror in his eyes as he whispered, "It's her. It's Chloe." The shadows seemed to swell, rising up and pressing down, making the room feel like it was closing in on them. The guide stumbled backward, tripping over something cold and solid. He looked down and realized, with a jolt of terror, that he had stepped into the outline of a footprint in the dust, a footprint that hadn't been there moments ago, but was now part of a trail leading toward the center of the room. Ben looked back at the mirror, his reflection now almost unrecognizable, a twisted, mocking version of himself, laughing silently, hands pressed to the glass as though clawing to escape. But the reflection wasn't alone. The figure of a woman, draped in a tattered dress and wearing the infamous green turban, was standing just behind his image, her hands resting on his shoulders, her face half hidden in shadow but her eyes gleaming with malice. Then, without warning, the reflection began to speak. "You've trespassed. You can never leave." The group's panic escalated. The room felt colder, the very air heavy with despair, as if years of sorrow and rage were pressing down on them, swallowing them whole. The group struggled to stay calm, but the feeling of dread was overpowering. Every inch of the room seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, as if it had taken on a life of its own, filled with the restless souls who'd met their fates within these walls. Ben's heart hammered as he watched his distorted reflection lean closer, whispering words he couldn't make out, its eyes shining with an unnatural light. Chloe's ghostly figure behind his reflection seemed to sway, her cold gaze never leaving him. He felt her fingers cold, almost sharp, digging into his shoulders, and he realized with horror that he could feel her touch, as though she were somehow reaching through the mirror. Lisa, who was closest to Ben, reached out, her hand trembling, but froze when the shadowy children in the room began to move. They approached in eerie silence, their faces expressionless, their eyes vacant. One small figure, a girl with long, tangled hair, reached out her hand, beckoning to them. A whisper floated through the air, soft and filled with sorrow. "Come play with us." The guide's voice, normally steady, cracked as he urged, "Whatever you do, don't follow them. Don't make eye contact." His warning was too late for another in their group, Tom, who had been staring transfixed at the children. He took an involuntary step forward, his face blank, as though he were in a trance. Lisa grabbed Tom's arm, pulling him back just as his hand reached out toward the spectral girl. But the girl's face twisted, her innocent expression melting into something sinister. Her eyes turned hollow, her mouth curling into a cruel smile as she let out a low, guttural hiss, revealing jagged, darkened teeth. Suddenly, the children dissolved into shadows, swirling around the group with a sound like distant, mocking laughter. The mirror began to ripple again, as though it were a portal to some otherworldly realm, beckoning them to step closer. A heavy mist seeped from the glass, filling the room with the scent of old wood and decay, wrapping around them like icy tendrils. Ben, still caught in Chloe's grip, felt himself being pulled toward the mirror, his feet sliding across the floor despite his struggle. He tried to scream, but no sound came out, only a strangled gasp as he felt his reflection's hands reach through the glass and clasp around his wrists. Lisa grabbed Ben, pulling with all her strength. "Ben, fight it. Don't let it take you." But as she pulled, a shock of icy pain shot up her arm, and she felt the same pull. Her own reflection was now smirking back at her, eyes alight with cruel anticipation, reaching out to her with an expression that seemed almost delighted. Then came a voice, a soft, sing-song whisper, echoing from every direction. One by one, they come undone. The guide, sensing they were losing the battle, shouted, "We have to break the mirror. It's the only way to sever the link." He grabbed a nearby candlestick, gripping it tightly as he raised it above his head, preparing to shatter the glass. But before he could strike, the mirror's surface rippled violently, and a spectral hand shot out, gripping his wrist with a bone-chilling cold that made him cry out in pain. The room filled with a deep, vibrating hum, as though the house itself were alive, feeding off their fear. The shadows began to swirl faster, the children's laughter mixing with Chloe's mournful wail, creating a haunting symphony that echoed in their minds, each sound clawing into their thoughts. With all his strength, the guide managed to tear free from the spectral grip. He raised the candlestick again and brought it down hard on the mirror's surface. The mirror cracked, spiderwebbing with fissures, and for a split second, the whispers stopped, the shadows paused, and the spectral figures flickered. The group dared to hope. But then, a low growl echoed from within the mirror, filled with ancient rage. The cracks in the glass began to glow with a sickly green light, leaking out like venom, and each fracture seemed to widen into gaping voids. The fractured mirror reflected countless faces, now not only their own, but those of strangers from different eras, their eyes wide with terror, mouths open in silent screams, as though they had been trapped for generations. One by one, the figures in the mirror began to emerge from the glass, stepping out into the room with ghostly limbs that flickered in and out of reality. The spectral children, Chloe, the twisted reflections, they all moved forward, reaching for the group, their cold hands grasping, pulling them closer to the shattered mirror's glowing, pulsating surface. The ghost hunters were surrounded, the room a whirlpool of dark figures and shadows that seemed to feed on their terror. As they struggled, the spectral hands grew stronger, their icy grips pulling them closer to the fractured, glowing mirror that pulsed with a sinister life of its own. The sickly green light seeped into the room, casting twisted shadows that made every corner seem alive with dark intent. Lisa felt herself being drawn toward the mirror's surface, which rippled and shimmered as if waiting to devour her. She screamed, desperate, her hand reaching out to Ben, who was also being pulled into the glass. He reached for her, their fingers just brushing before an invisible force wrenched them apart, sending her stumbling backward. The guide, gathering his last reserves of courage, yelled, "Stay together. Don't let it separate us." He grabbed a heavy iron candlestick, swinging it toward the nearest shadowy figure. It passed through the ghostly form, but the figure recoiled, momentarily weakened by the touch of cold iron. Encouraged, he swung again, giving Ben just enough time to pull free from the mirror's relentless grip. But as they tried to rally, Chloe's figure loomed larger, her dark eyes glowing with an unholy fire. She raised her arms, and a powerful wave of cold swept over them, freezing them in place. Her voice echoed through the room, both sorrowful and furious. "You trespassed. You disturbed the dead. Now you will join us." The green glow from the mirror intensified, and suddenly, the room itself began to dissolve, the walls and furniture fading until all that remained was darkness. They found themselves standing in an endless void, with only the fractured mirror before them, pulsing with malevolent energy. One by one, the spectral faces from the glass began to emerge, their hollow eyes fixed on the group, as if ready to absorb them into the mirror's cursed depths. The guide whispered, almost to himself, "We have to destroy it. It's the only way." With a final, desperate effort, Ben took the iron candlestick from the guide and, summoning all his strength, swung it directly at the heart of the glowing mirror. The impact sent a shuddering crack through the glass, the green light exploding outward in a burst of ghostly energy that shook the entire room. For a moment, everything went still. The figures in the mirror twisted and writhed, shrieking as the light began to fade, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke. Chloe's figure glared at them one last time, her face contorted in rage, before disintegrating into a dark mist that was sucked back into the fractured glass. The mirror shattered completely, each fragment collapsing to the floor with a final, echoing crash. The room began to reappear around them, solid walls and furniture reforming as the last traces of the green light vanished. In stunned silence, the group looked at one another, realizing that the haunting presence was gone. The house had fallen eerily quiet, as if it had finally been released from the grip of its dark past. The air was lighter, the oppressive cold replaced by a strange warmth. The guide looked down at the shattered pieces of the mirror, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's over." They stumbled out of the room, shaken but alive, each feeling the weight of what they'd just experienced. As they left Myrtles Plantation, they could almost feel the house watching them, its shadows lingering as if bidding them a silent, bitter farewell. Yet, as they reached the gate, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She turned back, glancing at the broken window where the mirror had hung, and for a fleeting second, thought she saw a face, a woman in a green turban, watching from the shadows. The face faded, but the faintest whisper reached her ear as they walked away. "You may have left, but you'll never forget." And with that final, haunting message, the group left Myrtles Plantation, each carrying with them the lingering shadows of the souls they had disturbed. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.